Welcome to the Gentleman Gunner, the ultimate performance shooting channel. Now today I have the Walther PDP Pro X, and I'm pretty excited about this because I have over about 50,000 rounds on Walther various striker fire models, and I absolutely enjoy shooting these guns. And so let's dive right into this boy right here. Essentially, we have a PDP 5-inch lower and a PDP 4-inch slide. Mated with this comp, this thing is a fun little combo to go with. And interestingly enough, when guns do come out onto the market, they can be a little aggressive on the pricing. But what's interesting about the market today is that we have a variety of choices when it comes to that sub $1,000 range comped guns. And that leads me to talk about the MSRP of $999. Now, I did pick this up from an online retailer for $950, but let's talk about the value proposition, if we will. Currently, Walther has the PDP Pro SD with a threaded barrel option, and that ask price is $899. Now, if you were to go to Parker Mountain's website and look at this specific comp, they have it listed for $100, putting you at $999. So Walther knew where they were going with this build the whole time, and that shouldn't be a surprise. Only difference being that you get a full-length dust cover. So in terms of the value proposition, it's more of a pound for pound thing, with the add value part being the full-length dust cover. All right, so now we are going to take a close look at this. Well, I will say it feels deceptive, and I say feels because this gun is a full-size gun. 5-inch barrel, the whole 9 yards, and even in the grip. But when you grab it, it's light. And it's got that familiar Walther ergonomic vibe to it, which means that they're awesome. You know, I will say that there are things they've done differently with when you get the Polymer model, which gives you these options of having different back straps on here. And so I currently have the large back strap on here, as you see. And the interesting thing I would like to take note of is that the medium back strap has more in common to do with the classic Q5 steel frame as well as the full-size PDP. And I like this large back strap because it is just a touch longer, but where it's mostly an improvement for especially guys with hand sizes like mine, which I wear XL mechanics gloves, is that there's actually more filling underneath the grip tank. It definitely has some contouring on the sides here for where you can land with your grips. This undercut is ideal, and that's something we saw all the way back into the PPQs, which was very welcome and needed. But with the full-size PDPs, it's not as prevalent because even with my hand size, you see I have plenty of room between my hand mashing against the magwell and the undercut. And the texture is interesting because it's not what I would call rough, but it is definitely got the traction that you need. I don't see this being an issue if it were to rub against you and carrying it in appendix. Now, you are getting a polymer gun, and so that slide to frame fit is going to be noticeable when you move it around. That's normal for a polymer framed gun. Now, I want to expand on that because one of you asked this question in the community. So I just picked up one 2 weeks ago. It was the only one, so I jumped on it. I noticed the slide and comp is wiggly from left to right. Does yours do that? And yes, it does, but that has more to do with the design of it being a polymer base rather than one of the steel frames. And I'll open that up to show you the difference on the Walther platform. Okay. So this right here is my old Q5 steel frame, and sorry I don't have the PDP steel frame, but from what I remember, the frames were actually a touch longer on the front and rear, and this is the PDP. Now this is actually the effective rail length here on the front and the rear. If you were to compare it just to my Q5, it's way smaller. Now why is that? Well, metal on metal is going to wear a little bit quicker than it would against polymer, and the thing is that polymer, although these are steel inserts, does have that ability to be malleable and mold to it. Here, that is rock solid. And if you're worried about accuracy or anything like that, it's going to be how well it's locked up, because think of it this way. If this were to move, it would not move until this particular bullet exits. And that's when everything starts to unlock and recoil begins to go. So you're going to be more worried about the fit here than you would here, which is what Walther definitely does well. And this was my big rave on the PDPs in general, is these serrations are nice and deep. You know, so racking from the top, is effortless. So talking about the sighting system, well, they went with their standard 3-dot system here. And the good thing is at least the rear is adjustable, but is it co-witness with a dot? No, it's not. It's even with the Holosun 50C, which sits pretty low, is not actually able to co-witness with this setup. Funny enough, I shot this gun at an indoor IDPA match, and I shot it irons only. And I will say I'm not necessarily a fan of the setup. Using it in a dimly lit range was more than effective for me, and I was able to actually maintain a lot of the accuracy at speed with this. So they are just effective if you're just looking to keep that. But if you want to run an optic, this is one of the big highlights of the PDP. I'm not going to be pulling out my Q5 yet again, but with the PPQs, if you notice that the dots sit really high on them, and why that's been positive is that the PDP does have the optics sit lower, so there's just less exaggeration in the dot. And having this large window of a dot, that was not something that was ever on my mind when I went to go shoot this gun. All right, so talking about mags here, you know, this is one thing Walther has always been nice on our mags, but they are a little pricey, and I'll show the current price right here for you. But, you know, in comparison to like Glock or anything, that is going to be an adjustment. Now, this being the PDP Pro model, you do get their nice aluminum extensions, and this gives you 20 rounds, and they give you 3 of these things. And I'll touch more on this when we go to briefly talk about the competition portion of this. And that leads us to talk into how are the reloads with this gun. Well, getting to my mag release here, this is interesting because you have this lip underneath here, so it makes bumping into it and getting your palm against it harder, but in terms of its usability, I found that to actually be nice. It was a good point for me to punch and purchase right there, and so anytime I had to drop this, it was definitely sprung and well loaded to go. So you can in fact flip that if you'd like to the other side, so you lefties can rejoice. And that is one thing too that's great about this, so your slider release is also on the other side should you be a lefty. I actually had a couple times, specifically in the match, where I went to reload it and we get hung up ever so briefly, and that's something that caught my attention because historically I've always had a very positive view on Walthers in terms of the reload because they've always just been easy to do. Now, I think what this is just a matter of metal on plastic crime, and so I think just not having the ideal angle in there, I had to work a little bit harder to get them in. Now, this magwell is definitely effective, and something I talked about in the PDP steel frame is these little edgings on the side that had this nice opening, and that's great because for 2 reasons. Number one, if you need to grab in there and pull that out, you can certainly do that, and the mags are already set up for that, so that's great. Now, if you run the +0, because they have a +0 base pad, it actually sits flush on here. Now, this is where this little relief becomes important because something that's always made me nervous is it just feels like I'm pushing it enough. But when you have this relief on here, and if they're going to sit flush, it does give you a little bit more confidence when you go to seat those mags. Now, just briefly talking about the barrel and the compensator, you know, this is a threaded barrel setup. And the one thing I liked about the steel frame version is that they had beefed up the lug over the Q5. And I see that carried over on the Polymer version. Usually the Polymer ones have a noticeably thinner type of lug setup, but this one is still pretty beefy, so that was always an Achilles heel on the Q5 steel frames, and that was something positive they'd done on all the PDPs apparently. And the thing with this is that this is going to be a screw-on comp, and so you may have to think about your laws and how that affects that. There is slightly different coloring, but that's only something you notice under a very scrutinizing light like I have here. But the compensator itself is one of a design I like, especially when we're running factory 9. And I'll elaborate more on some of my thoughts on that later on. But this comp is one design that I do appreciate because I feel that when you look at particular guns with ports, and particularly with guns like the metal carry comp, and guys, you can call it whatever you want, but this is a port, and I call it a port because there's definitely a hole in the barrel, although that the rifling ends right before it. Now, why I point that out is because the intensity of the pressure that comes out in a port can be more visceral in the dot presentation. And so when you're trying to acquire target, this is what this gun, and I felt the XR920P do well, is that they do the job to get the gun to return to 0 quick, but it's a nice and a gentle. Now let's talk about the trigger. This is their dynamic trigger from Walther, and this has always been an amazing trigger since it came out. Now, the one thing I want to point out, aside from it being an awesome trigger shoe, there is a firing group component here that what it does is take up the creep. So if you were to get an older PPQ or even the more lower end PDPs, you would feel a touch of creep, but nothing bad. It's just that this is arguably one of the best striker fired triggers out there. And so walking you through that characteristic, okay, it's unloaded of course. And so you've got to defeat this little shoe here. And getting used to it, it's a little pokey on the finger, but it's not like it would inhibit you. But this is the thing about the dynamic. There's very little take up, and it's a very, very firm wall. Now, Walther advertises this at 4.5, and I will do a couple pulls off to the side here to show you it. But this is after about 600-700 rounds. Now, as you see, there wasn't a lot of travel, and I like how my finger gets right at the 90-degree angle there. And the reset of this, also amazing. And that's it, audible and tactile. If you haven't been on my channel, I am a competition shooter, and we're going to take a look at this specifically for IDPA because USPSA, with this compensator, that puts it in open, and that's a different discussion for a different day. But IDPA, right? There are two classes this particular gun falls into. One is enhanced service pistol, which is just how it is out of the box, and I'll touch on that with one caveat, where you just run irons. And then you can run this, of course, in carry optic, which is what you see in this trim here with the hollow sun on top. Now, this is the regulation box, okay? And I'm gonna put this in here, okay? And if you can see, there's no issues. The width is perfect and fine. Wait a minute, we've gotta add in a mag because, well, this is where it gets interesting. And I don't know if you guys can see it in the camera there, but the rear sights are stuck against the rear of the box. So as it sits, it's actually not legal for anything. So how do you overcome that? What you do is you buy Walther's plus zero pads, and you can't buy factory ones because that will not work with this magwell here. So you do got to buy this base pad, but the plus zero version. And I have tried that on a PDP steel frame, and it fits in the box, and I know this will fit because the dimensions are identical. So just keep that in mind if you want to go for it. But in terms of weight, this thing is well underweight at around 28 to 30 ounces with the magwell, so that's not a worry there. Now, as far as holsters, I ended up using a Dara holster here, which is for a 5-inch PDP full size. So you can rest at ease that this footprint is in fact the 5-inch PDP, as you see there, and it's a great fit actually with this specific holster. Now, to tie out this competition portion of it, one of you had asked in the comments on the community is it competitive in IDPA against 2011s? Well, here's the thing. Kevin Harding, my good friend, won IDPA World, and not just carry optics, but overall, so beating PCC and every pro shooter out there shooting a Q5, not ported, and with an identical setup to this. So the answer to your question is, yeah, it is competitive against 2011s. Now we're gonna dive right into the shooting experience because, well, that's what typically sells these guns, right? Well, for this particular one, what we ended up starting with is testing out a variety of different ammo, and it fired everything from, of course, the Blazer 115 aluminum and all the way up to plus P ammo. So it is well suited for all that. And in the company of the Shadow Systems XR920P as well as the MMP Metal Carry Comp, I would say that this gun was on the lighter side of the recoil impulse in comparison to those two. And when I went to do the doubles with this, I was actually impressed with how well this gun returned to zero. Because if you see it, I was actually trying to pull out splits as quick as I could, and I was doing consistent 19 splits while maintaining about a 4-inch group there. And that, of course, is at 10 yards if you're not familiar with that. And that right there is a pretty solid indicator that this gun is on a trajectory to be a well-performing gun. Now, I want to touch on one question that was brought up in the community, and that is your thoughts on how these tiny single port comps don't move much gas. Or do they do enough? That's a really, really good question because a lot of times, especially when we're talking just regular 9 factory ammo, some people out there, and I would say it's more of the guys that really don't want to test anything and have the opinion that a comp doesn't really do anything on a 9mm gun. I strongly disagree with that. Here's the thing. I think people that make that comment have a high expectation. Well, what does that mean? That means they have a high expectation that the recoil impulse as well as their performance and what they can actually visually see should improve. So this is why you guys need to get out there and actually do some real drills and time them. And any of the comp guns you've seen on my channel are at the top of the list for a variety of reasons. A large part of that is because this is really helping it return to zero. Now, I will say if you were running 9 major like you see in USPSA open guns, you will notice a massive difference in how that compensator works, right? And in those guns, you are blowing an extreme amount of gas through those ports in order to get them to work. Now that said, there is one thing to think about, and Walther actually puts this on their website, and I'm glad they did because this really takes this discussion in the right direction. And it's the ammo they do not recommend. And if you notice, what they don't recommend is 147 grain ammo, most of it which is subsonic. And the reason for that, well, they clearly say it right there, is you just don't have enough gas to make this work. Now I want to talk about the accuracy because of all the Walthers I've shot in the past, they've been known for the accuracy. Now I want to put the caveat in there that yes, it is in control of my hands as a shooter. And so I ended up doing a decent grip, and I'd say from a mechanical accuracy standpoint, it was okay with about a 3-inch grouping. Now to extrapolate that on the practical sense, when I did this offhanded was definitely a challenge. I was very surprised that I was not able to match that. And there would be 2 things I would say to that. Number one, the weight of the gun being as light as it is, while it has ideal ergonomics, I just couldn't stabilize this gun to where I could extrapolate that type of precision. The other thing is too, is I would like to see the pull weight come down a little bit. And yes, guys, that is on me in terms of that result, but we can do things to guns to make things a little easier. And when I pulled this gun in and you saw the pulls on it, it definitely has some room for improvement. Now, the 25-yard build drill is where it found more of a stride, at least in my hands. The average time for this gun was 3.97. And if you're looking at past comparables, that's actually a touch quicker. So I was splitting this gun a little quicker. And a large part of that is because the information I saw in the dot really encouraged me to do so. And after I'd started to roll into it a little bit more, I started to tighten up some of the accuracy component of this gun. Here's the thing, the MMP metal carry comp is a gun that always stood out to me on this test because that was a gun with the more I engaged it, the better it shot. Now I say that because this gun was particularly indifferent to whether I gripped it harder or less. When I just gripped it ideally and had good solid wrist lock is when I found the maximum performance for this. Now for me and my preference, I actually like a little bit more feedback in terms of recoil, and this one's probably a little on the soft side for me. So although I had good splits and times, getting the shots I needed just didn't happen as ideal as it has with other guns. So, you know, with time I can get there, but I'm comfortable telling you guys that for where I was on this drill, it just wasn't going to happen much more, which is why, although it was quicker, didn't take the top spot in terms of hit factor. The next drill was my transition drill, and that's my designated target drill where I alternate between steel and a variety of USPSA targets. The average time was 5:14 with this gun, whereas the other 3 that I've talked about on this channel previously were well anywhere from the mid to high 4s. Now, speed isn't everything if you can't hit everything, and that is the one benefit of actually being patient with this gun because it didn't have the lowest hit factor. So, and the hit factor was 9.337, and listing the other 3 here puts us about 3rd place out of the 4 if we're using that as a comparison basis. And so here's the thing, guys. I present that data for you all to kind of just give an idea ballpark where things land performance. It doesn't mean it's the all be all. What this tells me is, okay, why did I get this result? Well, number one, I'm going to talk about this, is the balance of the gun. Okay, now you've seen me do this test plenty of times on other guns. This gun right here, as long as I keep my hand straight right in here, you'll see where the weight of the gun is, which in this case is very muzzle heavy. Now, being a light gun, that's a challenge because I've talked about other guns being muzzle heavy, the Shadow 2 and the Staccato XC. Well, at least those guns had the weight to when I swung on it, there was that level of forgiveness that you get with a heavy gun, whereas with a light gun, you don't. And what that means on top of having a heavy muzzle is you just gotta let it settle, even if it's for another 500ths. Now, as I talked about on the 25-yard build drill, those 500ths add up, especially every time you are going in between shots and transitions, which is why we have the slower time. But one thing I do love about Walthers is they are a very simple gun, and as such, this gun in terms of reliability was reliable for me in the match and all throughout testing. It cycled every piece of ammo, and I just didn't see this gun in any way hesitating to want to fire anything. One thing I do talk about is how a gun is sprung, and typically Walthers are sprung very heavy, and I would say this whole combination makes sense. And I think for the guy shooting out there, you'll get the reliability out of it and the ability to shoot a lot of different ammos without being inhibited by how it's going to feel in your hands or how it will cycle, which is a huge positive. I will say this, if this was 2 to 3 years ago and they introduced this gun, it would be pretty exciting. But this is 2024 and specifically Q4, where we have a variety of options of different striker fired comped guns this day and age under the sub 1000 range. This leaves me to ask you guys this question. If you were to go with this, why would you pick it? Why would you want to take this home over the M&P Metal Carry Comp, the XR920P, or even the TTI Combat? Sound off in the comments below because I want to hear about that. Also, if you haven't seen my full review on the PDP Match steel frame, I'll leave that right here for you. And the guns I'd referenced out through this video, I did an awesome shootout on that, so I'll leave that right here for you. And remember this, do not buy the gun you love to shoot, buy the gun that makes you love shooting. And until next time, we will see you all at the range.